The Vietnam War was bloody for several reasons. Because of the bloody tactics used, because of the geographical context, and because of the ideologies of both sides. In that hell that combined jungle, bullets, and napalm, some of the most aberrant war crimes were committed, and women were victims of many of these atrocities, beatings, humiliation, and constant humiliation in a corner of the world that the authorities did not seem to care about. The girls were at the mercy of tired, angry, and unbalanced soldiers who, in many cases, were acting under the influence of drugs. In this new military history video, we want to review some of the hardest stories that women in Southeast Asia experienced. We will hear very hard stories, so it is worth noting that this is a particularly emotional and dramatic delivery. Even so, we believe that these experiences must be known to have a complete vision of one of the most studied wars of the 20th century. Without further ado, let's travel to the mysterious Vietnamese jungles. When wars end and become chapters in history books, what usually reaches the classrooms is data on combats, soldiers, and victories. But war is also full of acts that are swept under the rug, and Vietnam was no exception. Thanks to the stories of survivors, we can reconstruct some of the hardest experiences that the women of that Southeast Asian nation went through. Tran Thien Ngai was a 24-year-old farmer when a South Korean soldier followed her to her home to sexually attack her.
Dạ, mấy cô mới gặp ông mà quắt đây, ông cứ theo ông chồng cô miết vậy á. Đến nào quắt lúc nó là thấy cô con gái, cô hầu con gái nói cho còn tròn, còn giống người nước nó nói cô con gái đẹp gái nó theo suốt cứ vào nhà má cô ấy. Rồi nó theo chặn đường nó đi tới cửa bệnh viện nó chặn luôn á. Cũng như là cứ yêu ông mà mình hầu đã sợ mà nếu ông yêu thì hồi chiến tranh này.
After weeks of following her home, the soldier finally tired of waiting for Tran's affections from her and decided to forcibly her. Once the crime was committed, she disappeared from the city, and the young nurse never saw him again. Now, over 70 years old and with a life of trauma, Ngai hopes to receive some kind of apology or recognition from South Korean and American authorities. Unfortunately, that will likely never happen. Before continuing, let's briefly learn about the importance of South Korea's collaboration and the crimes its troops committed in Vietnam. Between 1964 and 1973, more than 320,000 South Korean soldiers were sent to fight alongside U.S. troops. In this joint struggle, there was a geopolitical interest in destroying communism in the region, but also a racial component. In South Korea, they despised the Vietnamese and felt that they were second-class humans. That's why any kind of brutal punishment was viable, since they didn't even deserve the treatment of a prisoner of war. With this disastrous ideology, thousands of girls and women were abused by South Korean troops, leading not only to deaths, but to numerous unwanted pregnancies. This explains the phenomenon of Lai Dai Hun, an insulting term that means mixed blood, and refers to the children of Vietnamese women with South Korean parents. These children lived lives marked by shame in a culture that never recognized the crime that was committed against their mothers. Many of these young people grew up illiterate, as they were denied education and had limited access to health and social services. There are no exact records of how many Lai Dai Han were born, but estimates range from 5,000 to 30,000. According to Kim Nak-yong, who was a sergeant and chief of staff of the Koreans in Vietnam, between May 1971 and June 1972, the units under his charge had no problems related to sexual violence, since they had orders not to harm civilians. However, the officer also remembers that there were rumors of group attacks in remote areas, but none of these versions ended in a formal complaint that could be investigated. Therein lies the problem, since generally the victims were low-income people who lived in remote areas and feared any exchange with the invading forces. As has happened throughout history, Once the war ends, the girls who were subjected to violence at the hands of their rival begin to suffer the contempt of their peers. Tran was not only outraged by the invaders, but her compatriots later accused her of sleeping with the enemy. It is surprising that this same treatment was what European women received once the Third Reich was defeated. After being forced to work in military brothels, they received contempt from their families and had to live marginal lives plagued by illness and misery. The incredible thing is that thousands of South Korean women share Tran's claim, but in their case, the complaints are against the Japanese soldiers who kidnapped thousands of girls to force them to work in brothels. They were known as comfort women, but despite their relaxed name, they lived through hell. In many cases, the troops of the Japanese Empire promised girls and young women a prosperous future with a job that would ensure them a plate of food. The reality was much darker. They ended up being sexual slaves in inhumane conditions. Let's return to the ordeal of the Vietnamese women. Tran's case is far from the only one that has come to light in recent years. Nguyen Thi Baker Tuyet was just a child when South Korean soldiers arrived in Vietnam as allies of the American invaders. At that time, her family owned a small tea shop near a military base of said alliance. Let's give her the floor to describe her great family tragedy.
Nó đóng ở gần nhà tôi, là nó đóng tôi biết chỗ luôn á, ở ngay Gò Vấp á. Ở đấy là kêu là cái chỗ là má đấy, là hồi đấy là nhà có bán nước á, bán dừa đó, là họ đi lên đổ rác, họ tới ngừng đấy họ uống sao không biết. Rồi hồi tôi cũng còn nhỏ, cũng mong đĩ đi chơi cũng hỏi, rồi cái thấy người Hàn Quốc vô hiếp dâm bả, rồi sau này thì vợ chồng về kình cãi, rồi ông bỏ bả, ông đi luôn. Rồi người đấy đi đâu mất mình đâu có biết, không biết, đẻ thằng con 5 số 9.
Tuyet was also a victim of harassment, and like her mother, she gave birth to a child as a result of these attacks. The hardest thing is that the young woman was never able to make a formal complaint. She never knew the name of the soldier or specific information to identify him among the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who arrived in the country. I Hate Her only has a face that year after year becomes more diffuse and difficult to cut out. In her own words, Tuyet had to accept that what happened to her was written in her destiny. When her mother died in 1975, the girl had to raise her siblings and her children. Her life was not easy, but she managed to build a home, and she claims to be proud of what she achieved after such traumatic and dark experiences. The only thing she demands is justice, the feeling that such aberrant crimes will not go unpunished. A formal apology from the invading armies would be enough, or a recognition from the governments. But something so simple seems at the same time to be very far from being realized.
Rồi họ tới họ làm cho mình khổ, có con rồi vậy rồi mình cũng khổ ghê lắm. Có con rồi người ta hay nói lắm, ta nói rồi mà con đấy nó lấy nước ngoài, nó lấy ra Hàn Quốc đồ là cũng nói vậy. Nó đâu có biết mà ấy, nó có đẻ con à thôi, người ta cũng thấy mình có con Hàn Quốc, người ta đã biết, người ta cưỡng ép mình đâu, trong nhà mình đâu có dám nói.
Among the cases of sexual abuse perpetrated by American soldiers, one of the most infamous is that of a young woman named Phan Thi Mao, who was kidnapped and murdered by a group of savages. Her case went down in history as the incident on Hill 192 and became a real scandal for the armed forces. Today we know about this crime due to the testimony of one of the attackers, who recounted what happened in an article published in the New Yorker newspaper. That journalistic work caused a huge stir and inspired books and even a film by famous director Brian De Palma. But before talking about sequels, let's review the facts. On November 17, 1966, a group of American soldiers held a secret meeting in which they discussed a macabre plan to kidnap and rape a young Vietnamese girl during the reconnaissance mission they would carry out the next day. In that sinister conclave was Sergeant David E. Gervais, 20 years old, Steve Cabot Thomas, 21, Robert Storby, 22, Cipriano Garcia, 21 years old, and Jose Garcia, 20 years old. All extremely young soldiers, but already seasoned by the fire and bullets of Southeast Asia. The next day at approximately 5 a.m., the squad entered the small village of Cat Tuong in Phu Mai district to conduct a search. Beyond the original mission, the soldiers were searching for a woman to commit the most horrendous crimes. Unfortunately, they met Phan Thi Mao, 21 years old. They gagged her and tied her wrists with rope and took her away, while her mother and sister screamed desperately. Later, the testimony of these women was key during the military trial of those responsible for the attack. After marching for hours in the Vietnamese jungle, the group of 5 soldiers and their prisoner stopped at a straw hut to camp. That's when the real nightmare for Phan Thi Mao began. Except for Soldier Storby, the uniformed men took turns raping his hostage. The screams echoed in the nature, but they were too far from any urban center for the request for help to reach the authorities. The next day, the group was intercepted by a Viet Cong unit. The shooting was brutal, and in the midst of the attack, soldiers Thomas and Gervais feared that the girl would be seen with the squad, which would arouse suspicion in their peers or fury in the enemy. That's why Thomas took Phan Thi Mao to a remote, overgrown area and stabbed her 3 times with her hunting knife. However, the coward failed to kill her. The girl resisted and tried to flee on foot, but Thomas caught her and finished her off with a shot from her M16 rifle. In this way, he put an end to one of the most aberrant crimes that occurred in Vietnam. Private Storby was the one who reported the crime, but the chain of command, including his commander, took no action. The young man had to endure threats against his life from his former colleagues who participated in the murder, but he continued his crusade so that Phan Thi Mao's death would not go unpunished. His persistence was eventually successful and led to a court-martial against the 4 soldiers responsible. During this process, the victim and his family were identified, and testimonies were obtained from the mother and sister. Privates Thomas Cipriano Garcia and Jose Garcia were convicted of and murder, while Sergeant Gervais was found guilty only of the murder charge. The Hill 192 incident remains one of the bloodiest and darkest chapters of the American intervention in Vietnam. Before moving on to the next case, we want to know your opinion on the matter. Do you think Private Storby acted well, or should he have done more to prevent Phan Thi Mao's death? Leave us your answer in the comments box. According to researcher Gina Marie Weaver, author of the book Ideologies of Forgetting in the Vietnam War, the role of statutory in the conflict was left aside by the narratives of both sides. Neither the United States is willing to accept that its troops committed horrible crimes, nor is Vietnam willing to make peace with its society, which in many cases marginalizes the victims. Weaver postulates that Americans have an inability to reconcile rape and sexual assault with the figure of wounded and psychologically damaged veterans. Both concepts cannot coexist in the North American imagination. Heroes or villains, never a middle ground. Photojournalism and cinema played an important role in problematizing North American actions in Southeast Asia. Films such as Apocalypse Now, Platoon, or Sins of War shed light on the most unpleasant part of the conflict, including the darkest activities of Uncle Sam's troops. But no record of that time is as iconic as this photo. You've surely seen it hundreds of times, but do you really know who the young protagonist of the dramatic capture is? Her name is Kim Phuc Phan Thi, and in 1972 she was just 9 years old when photographer Nick Ut immortalized her. She ran naked and screamed in pain as her body was being burned by remains of the napalm dropped by the United States. Fortunately, Kim was able to survive and became a tireless fighter for peace and the vindication of the Vietnamese people. The following interview was given in 2022.
So thankful that I have been learned so much about the lessons of life in my life. And so now I'm thinking about 50 years ago, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now I am in the right time and the right place.
Let's take up sexual assaults again. The big problem when it comes to accounting for these attacks is that the records were either ignored or directly destroyed. Complaints were generally never reported to the war court and were resolved internally, with a minor reprimand for the perpetrator of the atrocities. Worse still, at times, sexual violence was encouraged under the idea that the Vietnamese people should be tamed by force, dominating a naturally rebellious population with an iron fist. The outrages against peasant women were seen as trophies for the soldiers' hard work, a well-deserved loot after long hours of combat. Of course, this stance is dehumanizing and led to events like those on Hill 192. Some American veterans believe that violence against Vietnamese women was also motivated by growing racism within the troops, particularly against Asian peoples. The culture shock was shocking, and many young people saw these people as inferior beings without a modern and advanced culture. By not considering them peers, any atrocity committed had less weight and did not carry any type of remorse. At the same time, the establishment of brothels and the growth of prostitution in the region gave an impression of sexual debauchery. For many Marines, Vietnam was a gigantic brothel in which they could let their darkest instincts run wild. After all, they were far from home and any authority that could punish them for their crimes. This veteran's words are brief but revealing.
How did the guys look when they were doing this?
They looked like they were having a lot of good time.
Did you see anyone not?
No, I think everybody was just about everybody was busy.
According to military sources, only 41 cases of rape committed by United States military personnel resulted in court-martial. The majority occurred between 1965 and 1973. Yes, you heard right. Only 41 judicial proceedings after more than a decade of constant war in which hundreds of thousands of people died. It goes without saying that these figures are ridiculous. It is known that there were thousands of victims of outrages, but time and war were responsible for burying their stories. Not all the women had the fortitude of Tran Thi Ngai to tell her experiences in detail. We only have to wait for justice and for the corresponding governments to accept the blame and give the corresponding recognition to Vietnamese women. In this way, we reach the end of the video. If you are interested in this type of content on hard topics related to the world of war and its past, we recommend you subscribe and activate notifications. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.